Okay, let's jump in. You know that feeling looking at a really dense classic history book on the shelf? The kind you feel you should read, but wow, it looks like a mountain to climb.
Definitely. And today, we're basically going to climb that mountain with you.
Exactly. We're using excerpts from David Hume's massive The History of England. It's a classic, and we're diving deep.
And the scope is huge. We're talking Roman Britain right through to King John. That's centuries of history, drawing from editions from the 1860s and early 1900s. We're looking at foundations being laid often, well, pretty violently.
And seeing it through Hume's perspective is fascinating. His own notes, they tell us he really built his life around being independent, frugal, just so he could focus on literature.
Right. He wrote the Treatise of Human Nature in France, had success with political discourses, and interestingly, he thought his inquiry concerning the principles of morals was his absolute best work.
Yeah, and he describes this quiet, philosophical life, only really interrupted once, aged 50, by an invitation to the Paris embassy. He also notes near the end his health failing, this habitual diarrhea, feeling weaker each day.
So it's history, but filtered through this particular philosophical lens, you see.
Precisely. So our mission today is to guide you through Hume's account. We'll pull out the key moments, the surprising details, the big shifts in society, government, law, all based strictly on what Hume writes in these sections.
Think of it as getting the core of Hume's take on early English history, but without getting lost in every single detail.
Right, a fast track through Hume. So where does he start? Britain before the Romans.
Yeah, and Hume's picture is one of total division. States, factions, all driven by jealousy, animosity. Before settled arts and peace, war was basically the main job, the chief occupation.
So not a unified Britain at all, just warring groups. And their religion, the Druids, Hume talks about them quite a bit.
He does. He sees their system as propped up by political structures. And crucially, their beliefs weren't written down, kept secret. That secrecy, plus things like human sacrifices, dedicating war spoils, keeping treasures hidden in sacred woods, that gave them immense power. Religious terror, he calls it.
Which kind of explains why the Romans, who Hume calls usually tolerating conquerors, went after the Druids specifically. They saw them as more than just priests, right? A political threat.
Exactly, a force to be neutralized. It was Caesar who first really looked across the channel. Hume suggests it wasn't just about loot, but maybe more about the glory, the ambition of taking Roman arms into this, well, almost unknown world. He grabbed the chance during breaks in the Gallic Wars.
And that Roman presence lasted centuries, but it wasn't forever. How does Hume describe the end of Roman Britain?
He paints a picture of the Roman Empire itself crumbling, attacked by northern barbarians, provinces wasted. The Britons, having relied on Rome for so long, were left helpless, submissive to new invaders.
They asked Rome for help, didn't they?
They did, but Hume says they were ultimately abandoned. Forever. There was some temporary help from a Roman general, Aetius, but that was grief.
In that abandonment, that power vacuum, that leads directly to the Saxons, doesn't it?
It does. Hume tells the story of Vortigern, a British leader, actually inviting Saxons Hengist and Horsa to come over and help fight the Picts and Scots.
A classic case of the solution becoming a bigger problem than the original issue, maybe.
Absolutely, because Hume describes what followed not just as a conquest, but as one of the most ruinous and most violent revolutions in history. The Britons weren't absorbed or integrated, they were just pushed west, into Wales, Cornwall.
And the Saxons didn't create one kingdom, did they? It was more chaos.
Like the Heptarchy, 7, maybe 8, kingdoms Kent, Sussex, Wessex, Essex, Northumberland, East Anglia, Mercia. And Hume's insight here is that once the Britons were dealt with, the Saxons basically started fighting amongst themselves. That internal jealousy and ambition just resurfaced. Constant war between the Saxon princes.
What about their society before Christianity arrived? Hume has some thoughts on their religion, doesn't he?
He does. He calls it the grossest and most barbarous kind, based on old stories, not really institutionalized like the Druids. He thinks because it didn't make a deep impression, it was, well, easier to replace later. Woden, though, was seen as the ancestor of their kings.
Okay, so then comes Christianity, a huge turning point.
A massive one. Pope Gregory I, ambitious to convert the English, sends Augustine and some monks. Hume actually notes they were pretty scared initially, fierce people, unknown language. They even stopped in France for a bit.
But Augustine eventually makes it to Kent, 597. How was he received?
King Ethelbert was somewhat open but cautious. Hume says he insisted on meeting Augustine outdoors, apparently worried about magic spells. But ultimately, Augustine's mission was successful.
Now, that period of the Heptarchy, before unification, Hume gives examples of how brutal and unstable things were, right? The successions.
Oh, absolutely. Instead of listing every single incident, Hume points to a pattern. You have kings just giving up and going into monasteries, others getting killed, crowns being grabbed and lost violently, rulers like Cenulf cutting off hands, putting out eyes, and personal tragedies too, like Queen Edburga accidentally poisoning her husband in Wessex.
So power was incredibly fragile, often changing hands through violence.
Definitely. Until Egbert finally manages to unite the Heptarchy in 827. That's a big moment of consolidation after centuries of fragmentation.
And after they settled, but before the Danes really became a huge problem, what was Saxon society like, according to Hume?
Hume's assessment is not glowing. He argues they hadn't really advanced much from their German ancestors in terms of arts, civility, justice. Christianity opened connections, yes, but he thinks the focus was too much on monastic virtues, piety, miracles, rather than active civic ones.
He mentioned something about the belief in miracles, doesn't he?
Yeah, he suggests that this widespread belief led people to neglect natural causes, and that things like giving generously to the church or doing penance often became ways to sort of pay off acts of violence or other sins rather than leading to real change in behavior. He saw a kind of transactional relationship there. High reverence for the clergy, certainly.
And even within the church itself, there were disputes, like the Easter thing.
Right, the Easter and tonsure controversy. Seems minor now, but Hume sees it reflecting a deeper power struggle. You have the Roman and Saxon way, emphasizing universality, aligning with Rome, versus the Scots and Britons, who emphasized their older traditions.
So it wasn't just about when Easter was, it was about who had authority.
Exactly. They agreed on the basic calculation day, moon, and that monks needed a tonsure, but not the specific day for Easter or the style of the haircut. Wilfrid was key in getting the Roman practices adopted in the north, and Theodore of Canterbury held a synod around 680 to solidify it. It was about consolidating Roman influence.
Okay, so England achieves this fragile unity under Egbert, and almost immediately a new major threat appears. The Danes, Vikings, Northmen.
Yep. Early raids, like on the Isle of Sheppey, were just the beginning. And unfortunately, Egbert died fairly soon after unifying the kingdom. His son, Ethelwulf, Hume describes as, well, lacking his father's drive, better qualified for governing a convent than a kingdom, is Hume's phrase. Ethelwulf even divided his lands early on.
Not exactly the strong leadership needed at that moment.
No, and the Danish invasions just ramped up. Huge scale, threatening total conquest. Hume does note the English were more militarily capable than the Britons they'd displaced. There were some early successes, like Troll's victory or a naval win by Athelstan near Sandwich.
But the pressure kept building. This brings us to Alfred, right? Alfred the Great.
It does. He was the younger brother of King Etherd. Alfred worked alongside him initially, but the Danes were relentless. They conquered East Anglia, killed King Edmund, they pushed deep into Mercia. Alfred takes the throne from Etherd in 871, and Hume stresses it was a really tough start, lots of battles, but the Danes kept getting reinforcements while Alfred's forces were worn down.
And this led to that famous low point, didn't it? When Alfred had to hide.
Exactly. The Danes broke a treaty, surprised Alfred at Chippenham. He was forced to flee, hiding out in forests, marshes. It's central to his story, that moment of near collapse.
The comeback king.
Pretty much. Morale gets a boost when another English nobleman wins a battle. Alfred comes out of hiding, rallies his troops, marches to Edington. Big surprise attack, major victory for the English, and they besiege the remaining Danes in their camp.
And the terms of the Danish surrender were really important, weren't they?
Crucial. The Danes had to leave Wessex, and their leader, Guthrum, had to accept baptism. It wasn't about kicking them out entirely, but containing them, forcing a degree of assimilation. This was agreed in 878 and led to the Danes settling in East Anglia and in Northumberland, the Danelaw.
But that didn't end the conflict entirely.
Not at all. The threat just shifted. More Danes attacked Rochester. They were repulsed. Others landed in Kent under leaders like Hastings. Hume points out Alfred started developing better strategies, now setting up camps near the enemy, besieging fortified positions effectively, establishing defenses that could repel attacks. He learned and adapted.
And this strategic thinking was part of a much bigger picture with Alfred, wasn't it? Hume really admired him.
Immensely. He calls Alfred a perfect character, a model ruler, a sage. Hume's insight is Alfred's rare ability to balance opposites. Ambition with moderation, fighting spirit with promoting peace, being strict, but also mild.
And his reforms were foundational for England.
Absolutely. dividing England into counties, hundreds, tithings. That wasn't just map-making. The tithings led to the Franks Pledge system, mutual surety, groups responsible for their members. It was about building order from the ground up.
And linked to that was justice. Hume makes a big deal about Alfred's strict justice.
He does. He even mentions Alfred supposedly hanging 44 corrupt judges. It highlights how bad things were before the ignorance and corruption Alfred had to tackle.
Beyond law, he championed learning, too.
Massively. He bemoaned the ignorance of the time. And Hume's insight here is that Alfred literally had to import scholars like Grimbald and Asterius because he couldn't find learned men in England. He set up school.
And practiced what he preached, becoming a scholar himself.
Yes. Studied languages, philosophy, history, geometry, music. Translated key works, Bede, Boethius. Sent missions abroad, even to India, according to Hume, bringing back knowledge, trying to teach his people about justice and industry. Hume sees Alfred understanding that a strong kingdom needed learning and law just as much as military might.
Which explains his reputation. Hume says foreigners and subjects alike saw him as one of the greatest, wisest rulers, second only perhaps to Charlemagne.
A towering figure in Hume's account.
So what happened after Alfred? His son Athelstan took over. More conflicts.
Immediately, pressure from Constantine, King of Scotland. Athelstan demanded a Scottish refugee be handed over. Constantine apparently warned the refugee, letting him escape.
So Athelstan
Invaded Scotland, ravaged the country, forced Constantine to submit. Hume notes English historians claimed Constantine did homage for Scotland itself. He also includes an anecdote. Athelstan supposedly told his courtiers it was more glorious to confer than conquer kingdoms. Hints at a certain political calculation, maybe?
He also fought a major battle, didn't he? Brunsbury.
Yes, against a big alliance led by Anlaf, a Viking leader, and Constantine. Athelstan won decisively. Hume shares a really striking story about Anlaf sneaking into Athelstan's camp, disguised as a minstrel. Athelstan apparently recognized him, but let him go. Later, Anlaf broke back in and killed a bishop who happened to be sleeping where the king had been earlier.
Wow. Shows the brutal, personal nature of things back then.
It really does. Athelstan had a more peaceful later reign, seen as an active ruler overall. The next major figure Hume discusses is Edgar.
Edgar came to the throne young.
Yes, but Hume says he had excellent capacity. A fortunate reign apparently secured the kingdom well against invaders through foresight and preparation.
But Edgar is mostly remembered for his church policy, isn't he? Supporting the monks.
That's what Hume focuses on. Edgar strongly backed Dunstan's project to kick out the secular clergy, regular priests, often married from monasteries, and replace them with monks. Hume quotes the accusations against the secular clergy, things like dissolute living.
But Hume is a bit skeptical about Edgar's motives here.
He is. He suggests hypocrisy, questioning if Edgar was genuinely pious or just using the monks who were his partisans. While the monks painted Edgar as a saint, Hume leans towards seeing him as a shrewd statesman. It's a good example of Hume analyzing the sources themselves, considering the bias of the writers.
And after Edgar, another troubled succession.
A very dark one. Edward, later called the martyr, was Edgar's chosen successor. But he was murdered, stabbed by a servant of his stepmother, Elfrida, who wanted her own son on the throne. Hume notes Elfrida did penance later, but couldn't shake the suspicion. Just shows the persistent danger within the royal family.
And this internal instability coincided with the Danes coming back in force.
Exactly. England had enjoyed a relatively long break because the Danes were busy elsewhere. But under the next king, Ethelred, famously known as the Unready, a nickname Hume says came from his lack of preparation, the vulnerability returned.
And this is when the Dane Guild started, paying the Danes to leave.
Yes, Hume details this destructive cycle. Danes invade, cause devastation, and Ethelred, advised by Archbishop Siricius, decides to buy them off. £10,000 the first time after the Battle of Maldon in 991.
But it didn't work long-term, did it?
Not at all. Hume's insight is that paying them just encouraged them to come back for more. No real defenses were built up. So they returned in 994, got £16,000, returned again around 1001, got £24,000. It showed a fundamental weakness and inability or unwillingness to defend the kingdom.
Hume mentions the Danes were still fierce warriors, sometimes invited by their own countrymen settled in Normandy, and internal treachery was a problem too. Edric Striona.
Yes, Hume repeatedly points to Edric Striona's betrayals, accusing him of stirring up trouble between the king and nobles, even murdering rivals. This internal division made England even weaker.
This all leads up to a truly horrific event, the St. Brice's Day Massacre.
In 1002, Ethelred gave secret orders to murder all Danes living within his kingdom on November 13th. Hume states it was carried out wherever the Saxons had power. a brutal act of state-sponsored violence.
And inevitably, that provoked massive retaliation.
Absolutely. Sweyn Forkbeard, king of Denmark, invaded specifically to avenge his countrymen. Exeter fell. Widespread devastation followed. Hume again mentions Edric Striona's treachery undermining the English efforts. Sweyn's son, Canute, eventually took over the campaign. After some resistance from Ethelred's son, Edmund Ironside, Canute gained control of England.
What did Canute do once he was king? Hume mentions Edric Striona again.
Yes, one of Canute's first acts was to execute Edric Striona. Hume calls it a suitable reward for his treachery. Canute also imposed heavy taxes, partly to reward his Danish followers £72,000 from the country, another £11,000 just from London. A huge sum.
But Canute wasn't just about force and taxes, was he? Hume sees him as quite strategic.
Very much so. He made a key move by marrying Emma of Normandy, who was Ethelred the Unready's widow. This secured an alliance with Normandy and helped him gain the trust of his English subjects. Hume describes Canute's reign as successful overall. He conquered Norway, went on pilgrimage to Rome, secured privileges for English pilgrims there, and crucially, Hume says he won over his subjects through fair and politically smart administration.
So, a foreign conqueror ruling effectively, but the succession after him was messy.
Extremely messy and brutal. Canute had sons by two different women. Harold Harefoot, son by the first marriage, took England. Harthacnut, son by Emma, ruled Denmark. Then Alfred, another son of the previous King Ethelred and Emma, was invited back to England.
And that ended badly.
Horribly. Hume says Alfred was betrayed by the powerful Earl Godwin, captured, and his 600 companions were murdered. Alfred himself was blinded and died soon after. Harold Harefoot's men did the deed, but Harthacnut later became king and reportedly had Alfred's body dug up and thrown in the Thames. Hume states Godwin was universally believed to be the main instigator of Alfred's murder, despite later trying to clear his name.
A really dark period. By this time, Hume suggests the lines between Dane and English were blurring.
Yeah, he points to several factors.
Yeah.
Canute's rule, the next King Edward's wildness, the Danes dispersing similar languages and laws, plus troubles back in Denmark drawing attention away. Ultimately, Hume notes, the Norman Conquest would soon make the distinction irrelevant by subjecting both groups.
Which brings us to Edward the Confessor. His reign was seen as ending Danish rule, but Hume has a different angle, doesn't he?
He does. Hume's insight is that Edward's reign, while ending Danish dominance, actually paved the way for Norman influence. Edward had grown up in exile in Normandy. He liked Norman ways.
So he filled his court with Normans.
Exactly. Hume says they were seen as having superior cultivation. Their language, customs, laws became fashionable. French was studied widely. People imitated Norman dress and manners. Even lawyers started using French. And the church felt it too, with Norman bishops appointed, like Robert of Canterbury.
And this favoritism caused problems with the English nobles, especially Earl Godwin.
Big problems. Godwin was the most powerful English earl. When Edward tried to assert authority over him, Godwin basically prepared to fight back, using a border dispute as a pretext. Hume notes many English nobles sided with Godwin. His party won out, forcing Edward to dismiss his Norman favorites, who mostly fled the country.
But Godwin didn't stay dominant forever. He was exiled.
Briefly, yes, exiled to Flanders. But he didn't stay quiet. He got ships, tried to land, was initially repulsed, but then he came back with more support, sailed up the Thames, causing chaos in London.
How did that resolve?
Hume says the king wanted to resist, but the English nobility stepped in again and brokered a deal. Godwin and his sons were restored to power, Norman influence was temporarily overthrown, and even Godwin's daughter, Queen Editha, who Edward had sidelined, was brought back.
After Godwin died, his son Harold took over his power base. Harold Godwinson.
Yes, Harold became incredibly powerful, controlling Wessex, Sussex, Kent, Essex. Hume describes him as more skillful politically, more adept, maybe more virtuous than his father. He managed to gain Edward the Confessor's goodwill and built up his own support through generosity and charm, all while quietly nursing his own ambition.
He had rivals, though.
He did, notably Algar, from a rival family. Harold managed to get Algar expelled twice. Algar tried invading with allies, but his death eventually removed that threat. Harold also maneuvered to get his own brother, Tosti, appointed as Duke of Northumberland after the powerful Siward died. Hume mentions Siward had success in Scotland against Macbeth, whom he describes as lacking genius in a turbulent country.
This sets up that crucial trip Harold makes to Normandy. Why did Edward send him?
According to Hume, Edward sent Harold to Normandy specifically to confirm a promise Edward had apparently made years earlier, that William, Duke of Normandy, would succeed him to the English throne. This promise itself stemmed from William's father, Duke Robert, making William his heir before going on pilgrimage.
So William already felt he had a claim, and Harold gets shipwrecked there.
Yes, shipwrecked and captured by a local count. William demanded Harold's release and then treated him, Hume says, with respect and magnificence. But then came the crucial part. William made Harold swear an oath, confirming William's claim to the English throne.
And there was a trick involved.
Hume adds the detail that William secretly placed holy relics under the table where Harold swore the oath. When William revealed them afterwards, Harold was visibly shocked but tried to hide it, making professions of his intent to keep the promise. That oath, extracted under duress and involving deception with the relics, became a cornerstone of William's justification later.
Which brings us right to the edge of 1066. January 5th, Edward the Confessor dies, childless.
Instantly creating a massive succession crisis.
And Harold doesn't hesitate, does he? Hume sees his actions as
a usurpation. Hume suggests Harold's ambition led him to find ways to justify breaking that oath sworn in Normandy. Whether Edward actually named Harold's successor on his deathbed was debated. Hume notes, sources differ, but Harold's supporters acted immediately. He was crowned king right away, without waiting for the full council of the realm to meet. Hume calls it an irregular election or pretended destination, even though initially the country seemed to accept it.
But challenges arose almost immediately.
Right away. Harold's own brother, Tosti, exiled from Northumberland, went stirring up trouble. First, he encouraged William in Normandy, then he teamed up with Harold Hardrada, the formidable king of Norway.
And William, meanwhile, was furious. How did he prepare?
He used Harold's broken oath and Edward's alleged promise as justification. Crucially, Hume notes, William sought and got the Pope's blessing. Pope Alexander III sent him a consecrated banner and a ring supposedly containing a hair of St. Peter. Hume's dry comment, ambition and violence were covered by religion. William also had to work hard to persuade his own Norman barons who were initially reluctant, but his promises and eloquence won them over to build the invasion fleet.
While William was getting ready, the Norwegian invasion happened. Hardrada and Tosti.
Yes, they landed in the north, defeated the local English forces near York, and York actually surrendered to them.
Harold Godwinson's reaction was incredibly fast, wasn't it?
Amazingly fast. He force-marched his army north, took the Norwegians completely by surprise at Stamford Bridge. A total rout. Both Hardrada and Tosti were killed. A huge victory for Harold.
But Hume points out a crucial mistake Harold made right after this victory.
Yes, he refused to share the spoils captured from the Norwegians with his own troops. This apparently alienated many of them, right at the moment he needed their loyalty most.
Because while Harold was celebrating in the north,
the wind finally changed in the English Channel. William's fleet set sail. Hume notes, it was seen as divine intervention happening on the eve of the feast of St. Michael, Normandy's patron saint. William landed at Pevensey, completely unopposed. Harold's fleet, which had been waiting, had recently dispersed due to lack of supplies.
So Harold had to race his army all the way back south again.
Exactly. An army already tired from the march north and the battle, and now partly disgruntled over the spoils. He gathered reinforcements where he could, but it set the stage for the decisive clash near Hastings. Harold chose his position on Senlac Hill. Hume mentions Harold actually offered William money to leave, but William insisted on battle.
And despite the disadvantages, Harold fought bravely.
Hume says he showed great valor. But in the end, the Normans broke through. Harold himself was killed, shot through the eye with an arrow according to tradition, then cut down. The English army collapsed. Hume does add a note acknowledging that historical sources disagree on whether Edward truly willed the throne to Harold or if he was elected, leaving that point somewhat ambiguous.
So William the Conqueror wins the Battle of Hastings. What next? Securing the kingdom.
Yes. He marched towards London. He secured Winchester, which held the royal treasury. English nobles, including the Archbishop of York, Aldred, started submitting. With Norman support solidifying and his army quartered in England, his grip tightened.
But Hume describes the immediate aftermath as pretty brutal for the English. Norman tyranny.
That's the term Hume uses. He questions whether it was William's vanity or deliberate policy, but the result was clear. William aimed to suppress, even extirpate, the English gentry. Justice became a bit of a sham. Mere suspicion could condemn an Englishman. Systematic dispossession of lands followed.
Did the English resist this?
Oh, yes. There were scattered attacks on Normans. Then major rebellions flared up, especially in the north, led by earls like Edwin and Morcar. They sought help from Wales, Scotland, even Denmark. There was another attempt in the south by sons of Harold Hardrada, but that was defeated. Rebellions in Durham and York saw Norman governors killed.
Did the Danes get involved?
A large Danish fleet did arrive and helped the northern rebels capture York. But William marched north, and instead of just fighting, he cleverly bought off the Danish commander, Osborne. The Danes sailed away. Other rebellions were crushed, and Garathling, the last Saxon claimant, fled to Scotland, and eventually only Hereward the Wake held out for a while in the fens. William used force, politics, and money, a mix of methods.
And one of the most fundamental changes William brought was feudal law, right?
Absolutely. Hume describes it as something William found established in Normandy and France, and now imported fully into England. It became, in Hume's view, the foundation for both stability and future disorder. William divided England into baronies, granting vast lands to his Norman followers in return for military service and payments. These great barons then granted parts of their land to their own vassals, creating that pyramid structure.
And the Doomsday Book was part of managing this.
A crucial part. Compiled in 1086, this incredibly detailed survey wasn't just a census. Hume calls it the most valuable piece of antiquity precisely because it allowed William to know exactly who held what land and what taxes and services were owed. It calculated his revenue at a massive £480,000 a year.
Which Hume calculates was an enormous sum back there.
Equivalent to maybe £9 or £10 million in Hume's own time, he estimated. And that's without needing a large standing army, as feudal service provided troops. Royal lands, the domains, were also a huge source of income.
Did William clash with the church? Papal power was growing then.
He did navigate that carefully. Pope Alexander III had blessed his conquest and expected deference. And Hume notes, the Normans brought a greater reverence for the Pope than the Saxons had. When the powerful Pope Gregory VII demanded William do homage for England and pay tribute, William's response was telling.
He refused the homage?
Flatly refused. "I owe you no fealty," Hume reports him saying. He argued no previous English king had done it, and he wouldn't either without the consent of his council. He did allow the traditional payment, Peter's pence, to continue, but drew a firm line at acknowledging the Pope as his feudal overlord for the kingdom itself, asserting royal sovereignty.
He also dealt with the existing Archbishop of Canterbury, Stigand.
Yes, Stigand was deposed in 1070 by papal legates. Hume suggests the official reasons holding two sees, getting his pallium from an anti-pope, were probably pretexts. The real result was Stigand's vast wealth was confiscated, and William appointed his own man, the Norman scholar Lanfranc, as archbishop. Lanfranc promoted monasticism, which Hume notes became a powerful force, sometimes dangerously so for later kings.
And William's death. How did that happen?
He died in 1087 from an internal injury suffered during a war with the King of France. Apparently, the French king had made a joke about William's weight, which sparked the conflict. On his deathbed, he divided his territories. The eldest son, Robert Courteaus, got Normandy and Maine. The second son, William Rufus, got England. And the youngest, Henry, got a sum of money.
So William Rufus becomes King of England. What was he like, according to Hume?
Not great. Hume paints him as ungenerous, wasteful, greedy, driven by impulse and a domineering attitude. He immediately faced rebellion by barons, who preferred his older, perhaps weaker brother Robert. Bishop Odo led it.
Did the English support Rufus?
Interestingly, yes. Rufus appealed to them, promising better government, lower taxes, restored hunting rights promises. Hume quickly adds were not kept. But the English sided with him against the Norman rebels, helping him put down the revolt. Shows the complex loyalties at play.
And Rufus later got his hands on Normandy anyway, didn't he?
He did. His brother Robert wanted to go on the First Crusade and needed money, so he mortgaged Normandy and Maine to Rufus for 10,000 marks. Hume notes, Rufus raised this cash through harsh methods, even making monasteries melt down their silver plate.
Rufus also clashed with the church, specifically Archbishop Anselm.
Yes. Hume first mentions Anselm successfully campaigning against the fashion for long, curled hair among courtiers. But the serious conflict was over church finances and Anselm's desire to appeal to the Pope in Rome over the king's head. Rufus essentially prosecuted Anselm, who ended up leaving England, his church revenues seized by the king. Anselm was welcomed by Pope Urban II.
Then Rufus dies suddenly. Hunting accident.
Yes, killed by an arrow while hunting in the New Forest in 1100. Suspicious circumstances maybe, but officially an accident. And his younger brother Henry was right there.
Henry I, called Beauclerk the scholar. He seized the moment.
Instantly. He raced to Winchester, grabbed the royal treasury despite the treasurer arguing Robert Courteaus had the better claim. Henry got possession, hurried to London, and was proclaimed king. Hume is clear. It was a usurpation, but the country went along with it.
How did Henry solidify his position? He made promises, right? A charter.
Yes, he started with what Hume calls fair professions. He issued a Charter of Liberties, promising to ease the burdens of feudalism and, significantly, restore the laws of Edward the Confessor, appealing to that Saxon past. An early important step in defining limits on royal power, even if driven by political need.
And he made a strategic marriage, too.
Very strategic. He married Matilda, daughter of the Scottish King Malcolm III, and Margaret, who was a sister of Edgar Atheling, the Saxon claimant. This Matilda had been raised in a convent, even wore a veil, leading to debate if she was technically a nun. But a church council ruled she was free to marry. This marriage, blessed by the returned Archbishop Anselm, was hugely popular with the English subjects because it connected Henry's Norman line back to the old Anglo-Saxon royalty.
Did he have to deal with his brother Robert?
Oh, yes. Robert returned from the Crusade and invaded England in 1101. Their armies faced off. But Anselm and others mediated a deal. Robert gave up his claim to England in return for an annual pension. And Hume adds a fascinating detail. 12 powerful barons on each side swore oaths to guarantee the treaty. He sees this as proof of just how independent and powerful the nobility were.
But Henry didn't stick to the deal.
Not for long. Hume says Henry soon found pretexts to prosecute the barons who had supported Robert. When Robert rashly came over to England again, Henry used it as an excuse. He invaded Normandy, decisively defeated Robert at the Battle of Tinchebray in 1106, captured him, and kept him imprisoned for the rest of his life. Henry reunited England and Normandy under his rule.
And Henry also got drawn into that big European dispute about investiture.
He did. The conflict with Anselm reignited, this time over the key issue of lay investiture. Could the king grant bishops the symbols of their spiritual office, ring and crozier? And should bishops do homage to the king for the vast lands their churches held? The Pope forbade both.
How is it resolved in England?
After much wrangling, a compromise was reached in 1107, typical of Henry's pragmatism. Hume explains Henry gave up the right to invest bishops with the symbols, ring and crozier, conceding that to the church. But crucially, he kept the right to receive homage from them for their lands before they were consecrated. This meant he retained feudal control over these powerful landholders.
What about Henry's later years? Succession was a big issue for him, too.
A huge issue, tragically. His only legitimate son, William, drowned in the White Ship disaster. Henry then spent years trying to secure the throne for his daughter, Matilda, often called Empress Matilda because of her first marriage to the Holy Roman Emperor. He made all his barons swear oaths to support her. Hume even mentions a scene where Robert Courthouse's young son was brought before a council, pleading for help against the usurper Henry. The dynastic struggle continued.
And what was England like under Henry I, according to Hume? Were Normans and English finally integrated?
Not entirely. Hume points out that Henry's own laws still made distinctions, usually favoring Normans. He also notes that violent feuds and private revenge were still common. Henry tried to reunite the civil and church courts, like in Saxon times, but Hume says the law wasn't really followed. So even under a strong and effective king like Henry, deep divisions and problems remained.
Which sets the stage for more trouble after his death, the reign of Stephen. Hume calls it the anarchy.
He does. When Henry I died in 1135, despite the oaths sworn to Matilda, his nephew Stephen of Blois made a quick dash for the throne. Stephen was personable, had support from his brother, a powerful bishop, seized the treasury in Winchester, and got himself crowned. Hume is clear. A blatant usurpation against Matilda in the sworn oaths.
And this led directly to civil war.
19 years of it, basically. Matilda landed in England, supported by her powerful half-brother Robert of Gloucester, and the King of Scotland invaded in her name, though he was defeated at the Battle of the Standard. Stephen had charm but lacked ruthlessness. Matilda was proud and apparently quite arrogant. The country descended into chaos.
Royal authority just collapsed.
Pretty much. Hume says Stephen himself often violated his own promises, making power his only guide. Mercenary soldiers hired by both sides lived off the land, terrorizing the population.
What role did the church play in this chaos?
A complicated one. Hume notes the immense power of bishops, who often acted like great feudal lords, weakened the crown. But, he suggests, in such violent times, the church also provided some kind of check, some limit, however imperfect. Stephen made a major blunder by arresting powerful bishops and seizing their castles, which pushed the influential Bishop Henry of Winchester, Stephen's own brother, to temporarily switch sides and support Matilda.
Hume paints a really grim picture of life during this time.
Horrific. Barons built unlicensed castles, adulterating castles, and waged private wars. The kingdom, Hume says, dissolved into rapine, slaughter, confusion. Justice ceased. Famine and disease followed. People were reportedly hiding in churches and graveyards for safety. It's a stark illustration of what happens when central government breaks down in a feudal society.
Were there major battles, turning points?
The Battle of Lincoln in 1141 was key. Stephen was actually defeated and captured by Matilda's forces. She briefly gained control, calling herself empress. But Hume says her harshness and pride quickly alienated people, especially the Londoners, who revolted. Bishop Henry switched back to Stephen's side. Matilda was besieged in Winchester, barely escaped, but her main supporter, Robert of Gloucester, was captured. He was eventually exchanged for King Stephen.
So the war just dragged on. How did it end?
Matilda eventually gave up and returned to Normandy around 1147. Her son, the young Henry Plantagenet, took over the fight. Finally, a compromise was hammered out. Stephen would remain king for his lifetime, but Henry would be his successor. The long anarchy was nearing its end.
And Stephen died soon after, in 1154, making way for Henry II.
Yes, Henry II, grandson of Henry II, became king, and Hume notes he acted swiftly to restore order. Dismissed the mercenaries, tore down the unlicensed castles, revoked land grants made during the chaos actions even his mother Matilda supported as necessary to rebuild royal authority.
Henry II was a very powerful ruler, wasn't he? Vast territories in France, too.
Immensely powerful. King of England, but also Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine, Count of Anjou. He controlled more of France than the French king himself, and Hume credits him with a strong desire for orderly government across all these lands.
What was his biggest challenge in England, according to Hume?
The power of the church. Specifically, the clergy's claim to be exempt from the king's laws and courts. Hume notes the clergy had become numerous, some of low character, and they were committing serious crimes, theft, even murder, but often only faced lenient punishments like penance in church courts. They claimed total independence from royal justice.
And this leads directly to the conflict with Thomas à Becket.
The defining conflict of Henry's reign. Hume introduces Becket as the first Englishman since the conquest to reach such high office. Initially, Henry favored him greatly, made him chancellor. Becket lived a lavish courtly life, seemed to be Henry's close friend and supporter.
So Henry thought Becket would help him control the church.
Exactly. Henry appointed Becket Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162, fully expecting him to cooperate in reining in clerical privileges. Hume states clearly. Henry was profoundly mistaken about Becket's character.
Because Becket changed completely.
Dramatically. As archbishop, he became austere, devout, resigned the chancellorship, and turned into the most fervent defender of church rights against the king. Hume questions the sincerity, suggesting it might have been a mask of sanctity, but the effect was real. He became Henry's chief opponent.
How did Henry respond? The constitutions of Clarendon.
Yes, in 1164, Henry called a council and laid out laws, the constitutions of Clarendon, aiming to clarify church-state relations and assert royal authority. Key points included: clergy accused of serious crimes should be tried in the king's courts. Appeals in church cases had to go via the king's court before going to Rome, and only with the king's permission. Churchmen holding land directly from the king owed him feudal services, just like lay barons.
Did Becket agree to these?
Initially, under pressure, he verbally agreed. But Hume says he almost immediately regretted it, sought absolution from the Pope, and refused to put his seal to the documents or observe the constitutions.
So, open conflict. Becket's trial.
Henry summoned Becket to a council at Northampton later that year. He didn't just charge him with defying the constitutions, but also dredged up old charges, demanding huge sums of money allegedly owed from Becket's time as chancellor, a debt Hume calls iniquitous and clearly designed to crush him. Becket argued, appealed to the Pope over the king's head, was found guilty of contempt anyway. Facing ruin, he fled England in disguise.
Where did he go? Did he find support?
He went to France, where King Louis VII welcomed him. Crucially, Pope Alexander III also backed Becket, condemning the constitutions of Clarendon. Henry tried sending his own embassy to the Pope, but got a cold reception. The Pope formally absolved Becket from adhering to Clarendon.
How did Henry react to that?
He retaliated harshly, seized all the revenues of Canterbury, banished Becket's family, friends, and servants, hundreds of people, according to Hume. Becket, in turn, started excommunicating Henry's ministers and bishops who sided with the king.
This went on for years. Attempts at reconciliation.
Several years. Numerous meetings were held, often with the French king mediating, but they always broke down. Henry wouldn't compromise on the constitutions. Becket wouldn't yield on church privileges. There was even a brief, pointless war between Henry and Louis over it.
What was the coronation of young Henry about? Henry II crowned his own son.
Yes, in 1170. It was partly a move to secure the succession, but also perhaps to bypass Becket's authority, as the Archbishop of Canterbury traditionally performed the coronation. Becket, from exile, forbade the English bishops from participating and got the Pope to back him up. Hume notes the strong belief at the time in the spiritual significance of the royal anointing. Becket eventually returned to England later that year under a fragile truce.
But he didn't calm down.
Not at all. He immediately started excommunicating bishops who had taken part in the coronation, continuing to defy the king.
Which leads to the murder. How does Hume describe Henry's role?
Hume recounts Henry, hearing of Becket's latest defiance, exclaiming in frustration something like, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 knights, Reginald Fitzurse, William de Tracy, Hugh de Morville, Richard Brito heard this, interpreted it as a royal command, slipped away from court, rode to Canterbury, confronted Becket in the cathedral, and murdered him there. December 29th, 1170.
The reaction must have been huge.
Immense. Instant outrage across Europe. Becket was immediately hailed as a martyr and saint. Miracles were reported at his tomb. Henry was in a terrible position, widely blamed. The Pope sent legates.
How did Henry get out of it? Did he have to give up Clarendon?
He had to perform public penance, walking barefoot to Canterbury Cathedral and being scourged by monks. He reached an accommodation with the papal legates. Crucially, Hume points out, the constitutions of Clarendon technically remained the law of the land. However, as part of the settlement, Henry had to allow appeals to Rome in church cases, which Clarendon had restricted. So Hume's insight is that Henry kept the legal framework, but the church won a major political and spiritual victory, and the king's practical authority over the church was weakened.
Beyond Becket, what else marked Henry II's reign? Ireland.
Yes, the beginnings of the English conquest of Ireland happened under Henry. Hume describes pre-invasion Ireland as politically fragmented, turbulent, valuing warfare over peace. An expelled Irish king, Dermot MacMurrough of Leinster, asked Henry for help. Henry gave him permission to recruit knights in England.
And these were adventurers like Strongbow.
Exactly. Richard de Clare, known as Strongbow, a nobleman of good family but limited means, made a deal with Dermot. Military help in exchange for Dermot's daughter in marriage and succession to his kingdom. Strongbow and others like Fitzstephen and Fitzgerald went over in 1169-70. They were incredibly successful, taking cities like Waterford and Dublin, defeating much larger Irish forces.
Did Henry just let them carve out kingdoms for themselves?
No. Hume says Henry became jealous of their success. He initially ordered them back, then repaired his own invasion. The adventurers quickly made peace, offering their conquest to Henry as his feudal vassals. Henry landed in Ireland in 1171, received the submission of most Irish kings and the adventurers, and formally annexed Ireland to the English crown.
Henry also had trouble with his own sons, didn't he?
Major trouble. His sons, young Henry, already crowned king, Richard, later the Lionheart, Geoffrey, and John repeatedly rebelled against him, often encouraged and supported by the King of France, Louis VII. And Hume notes many English and Norman barons joined them, apparently disgruntled with Henry's strong, efficient government and preferring the looser reign they expected from young, inexperienced princes. Even William, King of Scotland, joined the rebellion.
How did Henry handle that?
He proved more than capable. He defeated the rebels on multiple fronts. A key moment was the capture of William the Lion, the Scottish king, in 1174. This led to the Treaty of Falaise.
What was that?
A humiliating treaty for Scotland. William had to do homage to Henry for the Kingdom of Scotland itself, not just for lands he held in England. He also had to surrender key Scottish castles like Edinburgh and Stirling. Henry received homage from all the Scottish barons and clergy, too. It was a major assertion of English overlordship over Scotland.
And amidst all this fighting, Henry was also reforming English law.
Yes, that's another crucial part of his legacy. The Assize of Clarendon, not the Constitution's, a different measure from 1166, and later assizes reorganized criminal justice. He standardized the system of sending royal judges on regular circuits around the country. He formalized the use of juries, the grand jury to present accusations, and the trial jury, though different from modern ones, to determine guilt or innocence in some cases. He also improved procedures for settling land disputes, like the Assize of Novel Disseisin. Hume notes older methods like trial by combat or ordeal still existed, but Henry's reforms pushed towards more rational, evidence-based legal processes.
So, a really significant, if turbulent, reign. Then comes Richard I, the Lionheart, in 1189. How does Hume see him?
Vividly. Driven by passion, brave, enterprising, generous in some ways, but also greedy, prone to pleasure. Hume repeats a contemporary joke. Richard said his 3 daughters were pride, avarice, and voluptuousness. His overriding passion, though, was the crusade recovering Jerusalem.
And this crusade zeal had dark consequences at home, the impacts on Jews.
Tragically, yes. Hume reports that on Richard's coronation day, riots broke out in London, targeting Jewish communities who were already unpopular as moneylenders. These riots, involving massacres and plunder, spread to other cities like York. Hume links this directly to the heightened religious fervor surrounding the crusade.
How did Richard prepare for the crusade itself?
He focused on raising money and securing the realm. He made his ambitious brother John and his half-brother Geoffrey swear not to return to England for 3 years while he was away. He also dealt with ongoing rivalry with Philip Augustus of France, breaking off his long-standing engagement to Philip's sister Alice. Hume notes suspicions she'd had an affair with Henry II, and arranging to marry Berengaria of Navarre instead.
What were his main achievements on crusade, according to Hume?
He played a key role in capturing the vital port city of Acre. He clearly rivaled Philip Augustus, who fell ill or perhaps just had enough, and went home early. Richard stayed, won a major victory against Saladin's huge army at Ascalon. He couldn't retake Jerusalem but secured a peace treaty allowing Christian pilgrims access and confirming Christian control of the coastal towns. He left for home in 1192.
But his journey home didn't go smoothly. Captured.
Yes, shipwrecked again, trying to travel overland in disguise, he was captured in Austria by Duke Leopold, who bore him a grudge from the crusade. Leopold handed him over to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, who demanded an enormous ransom, 150,000 marks.
How was that raised, and what was John doing?
Hume says the ransom was levied on England with difficulty. While Richard was imprisoned, his brother John plotted with Philip of France to usurp the throne. Hume shares Philip's famous message to John when Richard was finally released. "Take care of yourself. The devil is broken loose." Richard returned to England briefly in 1194, quickly reasserted his authority, thanks largely to loyal ministers, and then spent most of the rest of his reign fighting Philip in Normandy.
Richard needed a lot of money for these wars and the ransom. How did he get it?
Through heavy financial demands. Hume makes a point of highlighting this. Richard levied taxes, like 5 shillings on every hide of land, without getting the consent of the kingdom's council or parliament. He even declared the clergy outside the law's protection when they refused to pay their share. He forced people to pay fees to have their existing charters resealed. Hume sees this as arbitrary rule, the king extracting money as needed for his own ventures.
Which brings us to Richard's death and the accession of his brother John in 1199. Hume's view of John is famously negative.
Scathing is the word. Hume calls him a complication of vices, equally mean and odious, listing cowardice, laziness, foolishness, treachery, tyranny, cruelty. Despite this character, key figures supported his accession, and the country accepted him over his young nephew Arthur.
And John's reign quickly went downhill, losing French lands.
Catastrophically so. War broke out again with Philip Augustus, who supported the claim of John's nephew, Arthur of Brittany, to the family's French territories, Anjou, Maine, Brittany. Arthur joined Philip, was knighted, and invested with these lands. Philip started taking castles. John managed to capture Arthur at Mirbeau.
What happened to Arthur?
His fate is uncertain, but Hume reflects the widespread belief that John had him murdered, possibly with his own hands, while imprisoned. This act horrified the continental barons, especially the Bretons, who rose in revolt. Philip Augustus seized the opportunity, invading Normandy in 1203.
And John couldn't stop him.
He failed miserably. Philip took major towns. Key castles like Chateau Gaillard fell. Within a couple of years, Normandy, held by the English crown for 3 centuries, was lost, reunited with France. Anjou, Maine, Touraine, most of Poitou followed. Hume attributes this collapse directly to John's military incompetence and the hatred his cruelty inspired, a huge blow to English power and prestige.
Did these failures make John even more tyrannical at home?
Hume argues yes. His danger fueled his suspicion and cruelty. He levied heavy taxes, scutages, and alienated nobles through his personal conduct and harsh enforcement of forest laws which protected royal hunting grounds.
Then came the major clash with the Pope over the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Yes, a hugely significant conflict. When Archbishop Hubert Walter died in 1205, the monks at Canterbury secretly elected one candidate. John pressured them to elect his preferred man, Bishop John de Grey. Both sides appealed to Rome. The powerful Pope Innocent III rejected both candidates. He then ordered the Canterbury monks who were in Rome to elect his choice. Stephen Langton, an Englishman, but a cardinal educated in Paris and loyal to the papacy.
How did John react to that?
Furiously. He refused to allow Langton into England and expelled the Canterbury monks who had obeyed the Pope.
So the Pope retaliated with the interdict.
Yes, in 1208, Innocent III placed all of England under interdict. This meant most public church services stopped. Sacraments like marriage and burial were largely forbidden. It was a devastating spiritual blow aimed at turning the people against the king. John hit back by seizing church lands and revenues.
It escalated further, excommunication.
In 1209, the Pope excommunicated John personally. This, in theory, released his subjects from their oaths of loyalty. John became increasingly isolated and paranoid, confiscating property, exiling bishops who obeyed the Pope. Finally, Innocent III took the ultimate step. He declared John deposed, absolved his subjects from allegiance, and formally invited King Philip Augustus of France to invade England and seize the crown.
So John faced a massive French invasion blessed by the Pope.
Exactly. Philip gathered a huge fleet and army. John mustered his own forces, but Hume says he deeply distrusted his own barons. He was desperate. At this critical moment, the papal legate, Pandulf, arrived with an offer.
An offer from the Pope? What was it?
Pandulf conferred with John. The Pope, perhaps preferring a weak, dependent king in England to a strong French one, offered John terms for submission. If John completely capitulated to the Pope would call off the French invasion.
And John accepted. This led to that infamous submission.
Yes. In May 1213, in what Hume portrays as ultimate humiliation, John formally resigned his kingdoms of England and Ireland to the Pope, receiving them back as a feudal vassal. He agreed to pay an annual tribute of 1,000 marks to Rome. He performed public homage to Pandulf, kneeling, placing his hands between the legates, the act of a subordinate vassal. Hume even mentions Pandulf contemptuously trampling on the first payment. The interdict and excommunication weren't fully lifted until John agreed to compensate the clergy he dispossessed. England became technically a papal fiefdom.
Did submitting to the Pope make John govern better? Did it satisfy the barons?
Not at all. His tyranny continued, and his military failures persisted. The barons were now disgusted not only by his oppressive rule, but also by his abject submission to a foreign power. Led by figures like Bishop Langton, whom John had finally allowed into England, and powerful northern barons, they started organizing. They demanded John reissue the Charter of Liberties granted by Henry III and uphold the old laws of Edward the Confessor.
They even appealed to the Pope as John's new feudal overlords.
Ironically, yes. But Pope Innocent III sided with his new vassal, John, and told the barons to back down. They refused.
So they took up arms. The march to Brackley.
Emboldened, they gathered their forces and marched to Brackley in the spring of 1215. They sent John a schedule of their demands, the core of what would become Magna Carta. Hume recounts John's furious response. Why did they not ask for my kingdom?
But he couldn't defeat them militarily, which led to Runnymede.
He couldn't rely on enough support. So he agreed to meet the barons at Runnymede, near Windsor. On June 15, 1215, after several days of negotiation, John sealed Magna Carta, the Great Charter. Hume notes he did so with a facility somewhat suspicious, implying John had no real intention of keeping it.
What does Hume see as the key points of Magna Carta? Is it all just feudal regulations?
He breaks it down. Some articles are technical feudal matters regulating inheritance fees, reliefs, wardship, summoning barons to the council, ensuring fines were proportionate. He mentions the clause protecting a peasant's basic tools.
But there were broader principles too, the famous clauses.
Yes. Hume highlights those as involving the chief securities of person and property. Clause 39. No free man shall be arrested, imprisoned, outlawed, exiled, or harmed except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. Clause 40. To no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice. Freedom for merchants to travel. Hume's crucial insight here, though, is that while these principles were vital, the charter primarily benefited the few, the barons, knights, churchmen, merchants, freemen. It offered little direct protection for the vast majority of the population, the unfree peasants or villains, apart from that clause about their tools.
So a landmark, but limited in scope initially, and the barons didn't trust John to keep his word.
Not for a second. Hume emphasizes the security clause, Clause 61, stemmed directly from John's faithless and tyrannical character. They kept control of London. They appointed a council of 25 barons as conservators of the peace, with extraordinary powers. Any four of them could declare the king in breach of the charter, and after 40 days authorize all the barons to seize John's castles, lands, and possessions, everything except the king himself and his immediate family until he complied. Hume calls this security measure exorbitant.
How did John react once the barons dispersed?
Exactly as they feared. He immediately sought help from his overlord, Pope Innocent III, complaining he'd been forced to sign the charter under duress. The Pope, furious at the barons for defying both their king and him, swiftly annulled Magna Carta, declared it void, absolved everyone from obeying it, and excommunicated the leading barons.
Did everyone just obey the Pope? What about Archbishop Langton?
Langton, who had helped draft the charter, actually refused to publish the Pope's excommunication sentence against the barons. For this defiance, the Pope suspended him from office.
So back to civil war.
Yes, the barons saw no choice. Feeling betrayed by John and condemned by the Pope, they took a drastic step. They invited Louis, the eldest son of the King of France, to come over and claim the English throne. Their argument was that John had forfeited the crown by his tyranny and his submission to the Pope. Louis, tempted, disregarded papal threats and invaded England in 1216.
And John died in the middle of all this.
Yes, in October 1216, John died suddenly of illness while campaigning. His death, Hume suggests, actually saved England from the difficult choice between a treacherous tyrant and foreign rule. He ends his account of John by repeating his harsh verdict, a ruler defined by a complication of vices equally mean and odious. End quote. So if we step back and think about this whole sweep of history Hume has taken us through, from those early tribal Britons, Roman departure, the chaos and eventual unity of the Saxons, the huge struggle with the Danes, then the massive disruption and reshaping of the Norman Conquest, and finally these turbulent reigns leading up to Magna Carta. It's quite a journey.
It really is. And certain themes keep coming up, don't they? The constant struggle for power, king versus church, king versus barons, just endless internal succession fights, the way law evolves from Saxon custom to Norman feudalism, and these gradual, often really violent steps towards putting some kind of limit on just raw, arbitrary power.
Exactly. And Hume, looking back, tries to analyze the structures. He questions if full feudal law really existed under the Saxons, arguing the Normans really imposed its heavy burdens, reliefs, wardship, marriage fines.
Yeah.
He notes factors in England, like its smaller size compared to France, and the survival of things like county courts from Saxon times might have subtly counteracted the tendency for feudalism to just empower local lords completely.
He also talks about who held legislative power, the Wittenegrat, the Saxon Council. He didn't see the commons there, right?
No. Hume argues strongly, based on the nature of things and the silence of the records, that the Wittenegrat was essentially an assembly of the great nobles and clergy. Ordinary townspeople or small landowners weren't legislative members back then, maybe just spectators sometimes. Parliament, as we know it, summoning representatives from towns, came much later. For Hume, the king ruled by getting the agreement of the powerful nobles.
And the king held executive power, ran the courts like the Curia Regis, the king's court.
Yes, with powerful officials like the chief justiciary. The Normans added the exchequer court specifically for revenue. And Hume details all those feudal payments, not just for inheritance or marrying off heirs, but fines paid to the king for almost anything. For getting justice, for permission to build something even, Hume notes, fines just to gain the king's goodwill. He specifically mentions how Jews were treated almost as royal property, a source of revenue managed by a special court.
He didn't think much of commerce in this period either, and mentions chivalry.
Commerce, he describes as generally low. Chivalry, though, he sees arising from these feudal military structures, the knights, the martial pride, the sense of honor, all cultivated by poets and romances. The ideal of the knight, defending the weak and the fair.
So looking back at Magna Carta through Hume's eyes, even though he points out its limits, focused on the barons, he still sees it as significant.
Yes, fundamentally significant. Because even if flawed and self-interested in its origins, it did set down principles. It put some limits on previously unchecked royal power. It offered some security for property and liberty, however narrowly defined liberty was then. For Hume, it marked a step, however hesitant, towards government achieving its real purpose: the distribution of justice and the equal protection of the citizens.
It's fascinating to see how Hume pieces it all together. Understanding these really early conflicts, these power struggles, definitely helps make sense of later English history.
Absolutely. And Hume's interpretations, his focus on character, think of Alfred's perfect character versus John's complication of vices alongside the political and social forces.
Yeah.
It makes you think.
It does. It leaves you wondering, based purely on Hume's account here, what did he ultimately see as the main driver of historical change? Was it the moral fiber or lack thereof in individual rulers? Was it the inherent logic or illogic of systems like feudalism? Or was it just these messy, self-interested struggles, like the one that produced Magna Carta, that accidentally pushed things forward? What were the real engines of history, according to Hume's narrative?